The vampire king walked into a diner and saw a waitress shield his daughter from a screaming manager. The room froze. What no one knew, the child had run away 3 times that month, and this human was the first person she hadn't flinched from. He made a decision that would bind them both under ancient law. Now please take a moment and subscribe to our channel and comment where you are watching from and what time is it. It is always fascinating to see where these stories get all around the world. Thank you. The crash of breaking glass cut through the fluorescent hum of Rose City Diner at 11:47 on a Thursday night that smelled like burnt coffee and the kind of exhaustion that lived in Mira Chen's bones. And she looked up from wiping down the counter to see a small figure in an expensive coat stumbling backward from a tray of water glasses that now lay shattered across the black and white checkered floor. The girl couldn't have been more than 8, dark hair tangled and coat streaked with mud despite the obvious quality of the fabric, and she stood frozen among the broken glass with her hands pulled tight against her chest like she was trying to make herself smaller. Dale came storming out of the kitchen before Mira could move, his face already red the way it got when he was about to make someone's night worse. And his voice boomed across the empty diner in a way that made the girl flinch so hard Mira felt it in her own chest. "That's 5 glasses. Someone's paying for this," he shouted. And his hand shot out to grab the child's arm with fingers that dug in hard enough that Mira saw the girl's face go white. Something moved in Mira before she could think about it. Some instinct she thought had died with her sister 2 years ago in a hospital room that smelled like antiseptic and failure, and she was already stepping between them with her body angled to block Dale's grip. "She's with me," Mira heard herself say, the lie coming smooth and automatic. "Take it from my tips." Dale's eyes narrowed with the particular suspicion of a man who enjoyed having power over his employees, but he released the girl's arm and stalked back toward the kitchen, muttering about incompetence and how this was coming out of her paycheck whether the kid was with her or not. Mira turned to the girl and crouched down to eye level, keeping her movements slow and her voice soft the way she used to with Maya during the bad nights. "Hey, you're okay," she said, and reached out to rest her hand gently on the girl's shoulder, expecting her to bolt or cry or do any of the 1,000 things frightened children did. Instead, the girl went very still, not pulling away, but not relaxing either, just staring at Mira with eyes too old for her face, and a silence that felt deliberate rather than scared. Mira felt the small body trembling under her palm, and something in her chest cracked open, some door she'd welded shut after the funeral, and she found herself running her thumb in small circles over the girl's shoulder in a gesture of comfort she hadn't offered anyone in years. The girl's breathing evened out slightly, and Mira was about to ask her name when the diner door opened and everything changed. The rain had been drumming against the windows all night, turning the street outside into ribbons of reflected neon, but when the door swung open, the sound seemed to stop. Or maybe it was just that every other noise died first. The man who walked in wore a dark coat that looked like it cost more than Mira made in 6 months, and he moved with the kind of stillness that made you notice him more rather than less, like a knife lying on a table. Mira registered 3 things simultaneously: the sudden silence of the kitchen, the way Dale had gone pale and taken 2 steps backward, and the fact that the couple in booth 7 and the man sitting at the counter had all dropped their eyes to their plates like they'd been struck. She'd served all 3 of them without really looking, the way you did on the late shift when every face blurred into the next. But now she saw the way they held themselves with that particular inhuman stillness she'd learned to recognize after 2 years working nights in Portland. Vampires. 3 of them, and she'd been refilling their coffee for an hour without clocking it, because she was tired and stupid, and her radar had gotten dull from too many nights running on autopilot. The man in the coat scanned the diner with eyes that caught the fluorescent light wrong, too reflective, and when his gaze landed on the girl under Mira's hand, his entire body went rigid. Mira felt the child press closer to her leg, not hiding exactly but seeking proximity, and she kept her hand steady on the small shoulder even as her brain started screaming that she'd stepped into something dangerous. The man's attention shifted to Mira, and she had the distinct impression of being assessed and measured and found relevant in a way that made her skin crawl. Not with fear exactly, but with the understanding that she'd become visible to something she'd spent 2 years trying to avoid. "Your name," he said, and it wasn't a question despite the grammar, his voice carrying the kind of formal precision that suggested English might not be his first language, even though he'd probably been speaking it longer than Mira had been alive. She should have lied, should have grabbed her coat and walked out, should have done anything except meet his eyes and answer with the truth. But the girl's hand had come up to clutch at Mira's apron, and she found herself saying, "Mira, Mira Chen, look, I don't want trouble." The man moved closer, and Mira saw he was handsome in the way old paintings were handsome, all sharp lines and cold symmetry. And there was something in his face, when he looked at the girl, that might have been anguish if it wasn't so carefully controlled. "By the old laws witnessed and sealed," he said, his voice pitched to carry to every corner of the diner, "I invoke sanctuary right." The words hung in the air like something solid, and Mira felt the temperature drop, or maybe that was just her imagination. But the vampires in the booths had all turned to stare now, and Dale had actually backed into the kitchen doorway. "Mira Chen is named shield to Sarah Thorne, my blood and my line," the man continued, and each word felt like it was etching itself into Mira's bones in a way she didn't understand but couldn't ignore. "Harm to one is harm to both. This mark stands." The girl, Sarah, made a small sound against Mira's side, not quite a whimper but close, and Mira's hand tightened protectively on her shoulder before she could think better of it. Someone in booth 7 whispered, "He's never invoked it. Not once in 3 centuries." And the words skittered across Mira's consciousness like ice down her spine. Because 3 centuries meant this man was old and powerful, and she'd just been bound to his daughter through laws she didn't understand in front of witnesses who apparently thought this was unprecedented. The man, who had to be Alaric Thorne if the girl was Sarah Thorne, looked at Mira with something that might have been gratitude or desperation or grim satisfaction, and she realized with creeping horror that she'd been maneuvered into something without her consent, that her instinct to protect a scared child had just locked her into a contract she couldn't read, with consequences she couldn't guess. Sarah hadn't moved away from her touch, hadn't even looked up at her father, just pressed against Mira's leg like she was the only solid thing in a tilting world. And Mira felt the weight of that trust settle over her like chains made of something more binding than metal. "What did you just do?" she asked. But Alaric was already moving toward them with Dale scrambling out of his path, and his hand came to rest on Sarah's head with a gentleness that didn't match the ice in his eyes. "I secured her safety," he said quietly, "and yours. My car is outside." The rain drummed against the windows, and the fluorescent lights buzzed overhead, and Mira stood in a diner that smelled like old grease, with her hand on a child who wouldn't speak, and a vampire king's attention fixed on her like a spotlight. Knowing that her shift had ended, and her life had changed, and she didn't have enough information to understand how badly she'd just been trapped. The car was black and expensive and silent, in the way that only luxury vehicles managed, sliding through rain-slicked Portland streets, while Mira sat in the back seat with Sarah pressed against her side and tried to process what had just happened in the fluorescent hell of the diner. Alaric sat across from them in the kind of stillness that suggested he didn't need to breathe, his attention fixed somewhere in the middle distance while the driver navigated toward the West Hills, where the old money lived in houses that pretended to be modest until you saw the acreage. Sarah hadn't let go of Mira's hand since they'd left, small fingers wrapped tight around hers with a grip that was human warm and trembling slightly, and Mira found herself doing that thumb circle thing again without thinking about it, some autopilot comfort routine her body remembered, even if her brain had tried to delete it. The Thorn estate announced itself first, through gates that looked like they'd been transplanted from a European castle, all iron scrollwork and stone pillars, then through a driveway that curved through trees older than the city itself, before depositing them in front of a house that made mansion feel like an inadequate word. Gothic revival, Mira catalogued automatically, the kind of architecture that was supposed to evoke romantic decay, but mostly just looked like money and isolation, all steep gables and leaded windows that caught the security lights like hostile eyes. The driver opened the door, and Sarah finally released Mira's hand to climb out, but she waited on the gravel drive with her head down and her shoulders tight, clearly expecting Mira to follow. Mira followed, because what else was she going to do, and walked into a foyer that smelled like old wood and lemon polish and something else she couldn't identify. Something mineral and cold that might have been stone dust or might have been the scent of very old vampires. Alaric moved through the space like he owned it, which obviously he did, but there was something about the way he didn't look at the surroundings that suggested he'd stopped seeing them decades ago, this beautiful cage he'd built or inherited, becoming just another collection of walls. He led them down a hallway lined with paintings that were probably worth more than Mira would make in her lifetime, past rooms that breathed emptiness, until they reached a study that looked like it had been decorated by someone who thought books were meant to be displayed rather than read. The shelves went floor to ceiling, dark wood that had to be mahogany or something equally expensive. And the volumes looked older than America, with leather bindings and gold leaf that caught the lamplight. Alaric gestured to a chair upholstered in burgundy velvet, and Mira sat because her legs were shaking, and Sarah immediately positioned herself on the floor next to the chair with her back against Mira's leg, not quite hiding, but definitely anchoring. The rain drummed against the leaded windows, and Alaric moved to stand behind his desk, backlit by a lamp that turned him into a silhouette, before seeming to think better of the power play and sitting down instead. He looked tired, which shouldn't have been possible for a vampire, but there it was anyway. Something around his eyes that spoke of exhaustion measured in years rather than hours. Sarah was attacked 17 years ago, he said without preamble, his voice carrying that same formal precision from the diner, but quieter now, almost gentle. A rival faction, old enemies, the kind of politics that turn children into targets because hurting the king's daughter sends a message. Mira felt Sarah's weight increase against her leg and resisted the urge to reach down and touch her hair, keeping her hands still in her lap, while Alaric continued. They left her unable to age, unable to speak, locked in the moment of trauma in ways I don't fully understand despite consulting every expert I could find. She's been 8 years old for 17 years, her mind developing but her body frozen, and every person I've hired to help her has triggered her flight response within weeks. Bodyguards, tutors, companions, therapists, both human and vampire. None of them lasted because she would run the moment she felt trapped. 3 times in the past month she's escaped to public spaces, human spaces where she could disappear into crowds, and 3 times I've had to retrieve her before someone noticed what she was. The words landed like stones, and Mira found herself doing the math. This child who looked 8, but had lived 25 years in a body that wouldn't grow, and a voice that wouldn't work, trapped in her own developmental hell while her father tried and failed to fix her. The sanctuary rite binds you as her shield, Alaric said, leaning forward with his hands flat on the desk. If she is harmed, you share the injury. If you are harmed, it's an act of war against my bloodline and I am bound by law to retaliate. The magic cannot be undone once invoked with witnesses, and you are now legally part of my household under protections that predate this country. Mira felt the anger rising hot and sharp in her chest, cutting through the shock and exhaustion. You researched me, she said, her voice flat. Found my weak spot. That's not protection, that's coercion. Alaric didn't flinch, didn't even blink. It's necessity, he said quietly. You're the first person she's trusted in 17 years. I would bind half the city if it kept her safe. The honesty of it was almost worse than a lie would have been, this vampire king admitting he'd manipulate anyone and anything to protect his daughter, and Mira wanted to hate him for it but couldn't quite manage it because she understood that particular desperation, had felt it herself in hospital waiting rooms, watching Maya fade. "She's not a possession," Mira snapped, gesturing down at Sarah, who was watching this argument with wide, dark eyes. "Does she even want me here?" Alaric's face did something complicated, grief and frustration and shame, all fighting for dominance before settling into a kind of defeated honesty. "I don't know," he said, and his voice cracked slightly on the words. "She hasn't spoken since the attack. I don't know what she wants anymore." The admission hung in the air between them, this powerful ancient vampire confessing that he'd lost the ability to communicate with his own child, and Mira felt something shift in her chest from pure anger towards something more complex. She looked down at Sarah and made a decision, turning in the chair so she could make eye contact with the girl. "You can kick me out anytime," she said clearly. "Blink twice if you understand." Sarah stared at her for a long moment, expressionless, then blinked once, twice, with deliberate slowness. Then a third time, faster, and Mira felt her mouth twitch toward a smile despite everything, because the kid was testing the system, making sure it worked both ways. "Smart," she said, and got a flicker of something that might have been pride in those two old eyes. Alaric was watching them with an intensity that made Mira's skin prickle, and she turned back to face him with her spine straight and her voice hard. "Fine," she said. "I'm bound. I can't change that. But we're setting terms right now. I'm not a servant and I'm not prey. And if I'm staying in this house, I need to know the actual rules, not just the pieces you think I need to hear." She watched surprise flicker across his face, quickly suppressed, and pressed her advantage. "That medical debt you're planning to use as leverage, the one from my sister's final hospital stay, you can clear it if you want, but I'm not staying because you paid my bills. I'm staying because she needs someone, and I'm apparently elected. But I need boundaries. I need honest information, and I need you to stop making decisions about my life without asking me first." Alaric studied her for a long moment, and she had the sense of being reassessed, moved from one category to another in whatever mental filing system he used for the people in his orbit. "Agreed," he said finally. "You're not staff, you're family under the right. You have full access to the house and grounds, protection under my name, and the right to refuse any request I make that doesn't directly concern Sarah's safety. I'll have my lawyer draw up documentation in the morning clarifying your legal position. As for being prey," his mouth twisted slightly, "I haven't fed from an unwilling human in 2 centuries, and I'm not starting now. The boundaries I can work with, the honest information I'll provide to the best of my ability, and the decisions." He paused, glanced down at Sarah, then back to Mira. "I'm used to control. It's what's kept us alive this long. But you're right that it hasn't helped her, so I'll try." Mira wanted to push harder, but exhaustion was catching up with her, the adrenaline from the diner crash fading and leaving her hollowed out and shaky. "Can I see her room?" she asked, and Alaric stood immediately, moving around the desk with that vampiric grace that was just slightly wrong, too fluid to be human. He led them down another hallway, this one lined with closed doors that probably led to bedrooms or storage or whatever vampires kept in houses this size, until he stopped in front of a door painted soft lavender and pushed it open. The room beyond was decorated like a children's magazine spread, all pastel colors and soft edges, with a bed that had a canopy made of gauzy white fabric and shelves full of toys that looked expensive and largely untouched. There was a window seat with cushions, a desk with colored pencils arranged in neat rows, a bookshelf full of picture books and young adult novels, everything a child might want. Except the windows had bars on them, decorative ironwork that was meant to look like part of the aesthetic but was clearly functional. Mira stepped inside and felt her throat close up because it was a prison, however beautiful, designed to keep Sarah safe and contained and isolated from anything that might hurt her or let her hurt herself. Sarah moved past her to sit on the bed, watching Mira's reaction with that unnerving focus. And Mira understood this was another test. See if the new human would pretend everything was fine or acknowledge the cage for what it was. She turned to Alaric, who was standing in the doorway, looking like he wanted to explain or defend or apologize. "Tomorrow we're taking those bars off the windows," she said flatly. "If she wants to run, she'll run anyway, and at least this way it won't feel like she's locked in. I'll take responsibility for the risk." Alaric opened his mouth, closed it, then nodded once, sharp and definitive. "All right," he said. "Anything else?" Mira looked around the room again, at the careful child-safe perfection of it, and felt that fierce protectiveness rise up hot and sudden in her chest. "Yeah," she said. "She gets to choose what happens in here. Redecorating, toys, whatever. Her space, her rules. And if I'm sleeping in this house, I need a room nearby, close enough to hear if she needs something." Alaric's expression did something complicated again. That grief and relief combination that suggested he was simultaneously grateful someone was willing to take this on and devastated that he'd failed to provide it himself. "The guest room next door is prepared," he said quietly. "I had staff set it up while we were driving." Because of course he had, because he was 3 steps ahead in planning contingencies, and Mira should have been more angry about the presumption, but mostly she was just tired. She looked down at Sarah, who was still watching her with those dark, careful eyes. "I'm staying tonight," she said. "Blink twice if that's okay with you." Sarah blinked twice without hesitation, then reached out to touch Mira's hand, just fingertips against her wrist, the lightest possible contact. Mira's breath caught, and she made herself stay very still, letting Sarah control the interaction. And after a moment, the girl pulled back and curled up on the bed, with her coat still on, and her shoes still tied. "I'll be right next door," Mira said softly. "You need anything? You come get me. Door's open." She backed out of the room and found Alaric still in the hallway, his face unreadable in the low light. "Thank you," he said, and the words sounded like they cost him something. Mira shook her head because she didn't want his gratitude, didn't want to be thanked for doing something she'd apparently had no choice about anyway. "Just show me to that guest room," she said. "We can fight about the rest of this tomorrow when I'm not dead on my feet." He led her 3 doors down and opened it to reveal a room decorated in creams and grays, tasteful and impersonal and mercifully free of bars on the windows. She walked inside and heard him pause in the doorway the way he had with Sarah's room. "For what it's worth," he said quietly, "I am sorry you were pulled into this. But I'm not sorry she found you." Mira turned to look at him, this ancient vampire who'd bound her to his daughter with laws older than cities, and saw the exhaustion and fear and desperate hope written in every line of his too perfect face. "Yeah, well," she said, "ask me again in a week if I still feel like it was worth it." She closed the door between them and stood in the silent, expensive guest room listening to the rain drum against glass that had no bars, thinking about a little girl 3 doors down who hadn't spoken in 17 years, and a vampire king who didn't know how to be a father anymore, and wondered what the hell she'd just agreed to protect. Mira woke to pale morning light filtering through unfamiliar curtains and the disorienting sensation of expensive sheets against her skin, her brain taking several seconds to catalog where she was and why before the events of last night came flooding back with all the subtlety of cold water. She sat up and immediately saw the small figure sitting just outside her open door, knees pulled to chest and dark head resting on folded arms. And her heart did something complicated in her chest, because Sarah had apparently been waiting there for who knew how long, patient and silent as a ghost. "Hey," Mira said softly, keeping her voice gentle the way you would with a skittish animal, and Sarah's head came up immediately, those 2 old eyes focusing on her with an intensity that suggested she'd been awake and alert despite the waiting posture. "You hungry?" Mira asked. then caught herself because the girl was a vampire and probably didn't eat regular food, but Sarah was already standing and moving toward the stairs with a deliberateness that suggested she wanted Mira to follow. The kitchen turned out to be enormous and professionally equipped, all granite counters and stainless steel appliances that looked like they'd been installed by someone who thought kitchens were supposed to be showcases rather than workspaces. But there was a coffee maker that Mira figured out after some searching and bread in a drawer that smelled fresh enough. She made toast and coffee while Sarah sat at the kitchen island, watching her every movement with that unnerving focus, tracking the butter knife and the steam rising from the cup, and the way Mira's hands moved through the familiar morning routine. Mira slid a plate with toast across the counter, more out of habit than expectation, and wasn't surprised when Sarah just looked at it. But the girl leaned forward slightly to smell it, nose wrinkling at the burnt edges, and something about that tiny reaction made Mira's chest feel too full. "You don't have to eat it," she said. "I just forget sometimes that not everyone needs breakfast." She ate her own toast standing at the counter, aware of Sarah's gaze tracking each bite, and wondered what it was like to remember food but not need it, to be frozen in a child's body while your mind kept aging past the point where eating had meaning. The silence stretched comfortable rather than awkward, and Mira found herself talking without planning to, just filling the space with words the way she used to do with Maya during the long hospital nights. "I used to make breakfast for my sister," she said, not looking directly at Sarah, but aware of her in peripheral vision. She had good days and bad days, and on the bad days she couldn't keep much down, but she always wanted toast. Said it smelled like normal, whatever that meant. Sarah's head tilted slightly, a question without words, and Mira kept going because apparently she was the kind of person who trauma dumped on traumatized vampire children over coffee. "She died 2 years ago," Mira continued, her voice steady, because she'd had practice at this, at making the words come out flat and factual instead of jagged. "Cancer, the kind that doesn't care how young you are or how many times you beat it before. I took care of her until the end, and then I stopped taking care of anyone because it hurt too much." She looked at Sarah then, really looked, and saw the girl watching her with something that might have been understanding. "But you're different," Mira said quietly. "You're stuck, and you need someone who won't run when it gets hard, and I'm apparently very stupid about walking away from kids who need help." Sarah's expression didn't change, but her hand moved slowly across the counter until her fingertips rested against Mira's wrist. The contact feather light and deliberate, and Mira's breath caught because this was initiated contact, the child reaching out first instead of just accepting touch. She stayed very still, and after a long moment Sarah pulled back and did something with her hands, a gesture that took Mira a second to recognize as thumbs up, held uncertainly like she wasn't sure if she was doing it right. Mira felt her mouth curve into a smile despite everything, and returned the gesture. "Okay," she said. "New system. Thumbs up for yes, thumbs down for no. Blinks for when you can't use your hands. That work for you?" Sarah gave another shaky thumbs up, and Mira felt that dangerous hope rising in her chest again. The sense that maybe this impossible situation could actually help someone instead of just breaking everyone involved. They spent the morning in careful orbit, Mira reading aloud from books she found in Sarah's room, while the girl sat close enough to touch but not quite touching, listening with absolute attention to stories about magic schools and talking animals and girls who saved kingdoms. Around noon, Mira asked thumbs up, "If you want me here tomorrow," thumbs down if you want me gone, and watched Sarah's hand tremble in the air for a long moment before the thumb went decisively up, and something in Mira's chest that had been clenched since the diner finally started to unclench. Alaric was in his office reviewing contracts for a commercial property acquisition when the messenger arrived. A young vampire he recognized from the council's administrative staff, who looked nervous in the way people got when delivering news they knew would detonate. The sealed envelope was cream-colored paper with the council's mark in red wax, formal and official in a way that made his jaw tighten before he even broke the seal. He read the contents twice to make sure he was understanding correctly, then dismissed the messenger with instructions to tell the council he would attend the hearing as required. When he was alone again, he allowed himself exactly 30 seconds of pure fury, hands flat on the desk and eyes closed while he fought the urge to put his fist through the mahogany before forcing himself into the cold assessment mode that had kept him alive for 3.5 centuries. Dale, the diner manager, had vampire connections through his cousin Counselor Voss, who had been trying to acquire Alaric's commercial holdings in the downtown corridor for the past decade and had been repeatedly refused. This was transparent political maneuvering using Sarah as leverage, a formal challenge to the sanctuary right, claiming that Mira Chen had coerced Sarah into contact for the purpose of trapping the king into a binding that would give her access to his resources and protection. It was absurd on its face, given that Mira had clearly had no knowledge of vampire law when she'd stepped between Dale and Sarah, but the challenge had been filed with sufficient formality that the council was obligated to investigate. The hearing was set for tomorrow at sundown, which gave Alaric 30 hours to prepare a defense. And the only real proof of the right's legitimacy was Sarah's own testimony that the bond was genuine and freely accepted on her part. Sarah, who hadn't spoken in 17 years and showed no signs of starting now, no matter how much progress she was making with the human woman currently reading to her 3 rooms away. Alaric pulled up everything he had on Voss, old grudges and political alignments and financial entanglements, looking for leverage or weak points or anything he could use to make this go away quietly. But Voss had been careful, and the challenge was technically legal, even if the motivations were corrupt. If the right was nullified, Mira would lose all protection under Alaric's name, becoming just another human who'd had brief contact with vampire royalty and could be eliminated without consequence if she became inconvenient. And Sarah, who had finally found someone she trusted, would lose that person and almost certainly retreat so far inside herself that Alaric would never reach her again. He spent the afternoon making calls and pulling files and constructing arguments, his mind working through scenarios and contingencies, while his body stayed perfectly still in the leather chair behind his desk. Marcus, his oldest ally on the council, would vote in his favor, but Marcus was only one of 13, and several of the others owed Voss favors or feared his influence. Elena might be sympathetic, given her own history with adopted human family, but she was also a stickler for proper procedure, and if the evidence suggested coercion, she would vote against the right, regardless of personal feelings. Thomas would vote however benefited Thomas, which meant Alaric needed something to offer him, and Victoria had been nursing a grudge since Alaric had refused her marriage proposal in 1847, so that was a lost cause. The numbers weren't good, he realized, as the afternoon shadows lengthened across his office floor. He needed either incontrovertible proof of Sarah's willing participation or enough political leverage to make the challenge disappear, and he had 30 hours to acquire neither. The smell of old parchment and wax from the council letter seemed to fill the room, mixing with the stone dust scent that clung to the estate's foundations, and Alaric allowed himself a moment of despair before compartmentalizing it and getting back to work. Evening came with rain still drumming against the windows, the kind of persistent Oregon drizzle that turned the world gray and close, and Mira found Alaric in the sitting room staring into a fireplace that held flames but gave off no warmth she could feel. Sarah had gone to her room after dinner, which Mira had made and eaten alone, while the girl watched with that same focused attention from this morning, and Mira had the sense that something had shifted in the house's atmosphere since she'd woken up, some tension that hadn't been there before. "We need to talk," Alaric said without turning from the fire, and Mira's stomach dropped because those words never preceded anything good. She sat in the chair across from him and waited while he seemed to gather himself, shoulders tight under his expensive shirt and jaw set in a way that suggested he was barely containing something. "The council has challenged the sanctuary right," he said finally, his voice flat and controlled. Dale has vampire connections, and they're claiming you coerced Sarah into contact to manipulate me into invoking the binding. It's political theater, transparent and corrupt, but it's also technically legal, and there will be a hearing tomorrow at sundown. If they nullify the right, you lose all protection, and Sarah loses you. Mira felt the fear spike hot and immediate in her chest, exactly the trap she'd been afraid of from the beginning. This sense of being a pawn in games she didn't understand, with stakes she couldn't see. "What do we do?" she asked, keeping her voice steady through effort. Alaric finally looked at her, and she saw exhaustion etched in every line of his face, the kind of bone-deep weariness that came from fighting battles you were probably going to lose. "I'm preparing a defense," he said, calling in favors, building arguments, doing everything I can to make this go away. But the only real proof is Sarah's testimony that the bond is real, and she can't give it. Mira thought about the girl upstairs in her pastel prison, about the thumbs up and the initiated touch and the way she'd listened to stories like they were lifelines. "She can communicate," Mira said. "We have the blink system, the thumbs up and down. That's something." Alaric's expression did something complicated, hope and doubt and grief all fighting for space. "It might be enough," he said, but he didn't sound convinced. "The council will want clear verbal testimony, not interpretation of nonverbal cues that could be coached or imagined." They sat in silence for a moment, the fire crackling and the rain drumming and the weight of tomorrow's deadline pressing down on them both. And Mira heard herself ask the question she'd been avoiding since this morning. Why did she run the first 3 times? She watched Alaric's whole body go rigid, his hands gripping the chair arms hard enough that she heard the leather creak, and for a long moment she thought he wasn't going to answer. Then he took a breath he didn't need, and the words came out quiet and devastated. "She was looking for me," he said. "The version of me she remembered before the attack. I used to take her with me sometimes when I went into the city, back when she could speak and laugh and wasn't afraid. She knew what I was, knew I fed, but it was abstract, not frightening. After the attack, I became more careful, more controlled, kept that part of my life completely separate from her to avoid triggering her trauma. But she started slipping away from her handlers and going to the places where she'd seen me hunt years ago, old territory I'd abandoned." His voice cracked slightly and he stopped, visibly fighting for control. "She was trying to find her father, trying to understand who I'd become. But those places terrified her, and she'd run before I could get there. 3 times I tracked her down in human crowds, 3 times I brought her home, and I never understood what she was looking for until the 3rd time when I found her outside a bar I used to frequent, and she looked at me like she didn't recognize me at all. I stopped hunting in the city entirely after that. Haven't fed properly in months." The admission hung in the air between them, and Mira felt her understanding of him shift fundamentally. This ancient vampire who'd been starving himself because his daughter was looking for a version of him that maybe didn't exist anymore, and he didn't know how to reconcile the king he'd become with the father he'd been. "You're killing yourself," she said quietly, and he didn't deny it. "I don't know how to be her father anymore," he said, staring back into the fire. "I know how to be a king, how to manage threats and deploy power and maintain control. But she needs someone who can just be present without calculating angles, and I've forgotten how to do that. If I've forgotten at all, maybe I never knew." Mira thought about the way he'd invoked the right without asking her, the manipulation and the research into her weaknesses, all the king moves that had bound her here. Then she thought about the way he'd agreed to remove the bars from Sarah's windows, the exhaustion in his face when he admitted he didn't know what his daughter wanted, the fact that he was starving himself rather than risk scaring her. "Maybe you start by stopping trying to be a king around her," she said. "Just be scared and tired and uncertain, because that's honest and kids can tell when you're pretending. She's not looking for perfect, she's looking for real." Alaric looked at her then, with something that might have been gratitude or desperation, or both. "I don't know if I can give her that," he said. "And if the council nullifies the right tomorrow, I won't have the chance to try. Mira felt the fear rise again, but also resolve, sharp and clear, and surprisingly steady. I'll testify, she said. Tell them exactly what happened. That I didn't know what I was agreeing to, but I'm choosing it now anyway. That has to count for something. Alaric shook his head slowly. It won't be enough, he said. Voss will argue that you're saying what you need to say to maintain protection, that the binding itself is coercive because you can't safely refuse now that it's invoked. Without Sarah's testimony, we're just trading accusations with no way to prove intent. The fire crackled and the rain fell, and somewhere upstairs, Sarah was probably lying awake feeling the tension through whatever bond connected them now. And Mira thought about tomorrow's hearing with a sick dread that tasted like hospital waiting rooms and lost causes. We'll figure it out, she said, more to convince herself than him. We have 30 hours. Alaric's expression suggested he didn't share her optimism, but he nodded anyway, and they sat together in the too large sitting room while the house creaked around them and the deadline approached like a guillotine. Two people who barely knew each other, bound together by a child who couldn't speak, and a law older than countries, trying to figure out how to prove something as intangible as trust. The council chamber existed in a space that shouldn't have been possible beneath downtown Portland, carved from stone that predated the city and felt older than the continent itself. And Mira descended the stairs between Alaric and his lawyer Marcus, with her heart hammering against her ribs and the taste of fear metallic in her mouth. The chamber opened into a circular room, lit by braziers that gave off heat and light, but smelled wrong, like burning minerals instead of wood, and 13 chairs arranged in a semicircle faced a single seat in the center that was obviously meant for whoever was being judged. The vampires were already seated, faces carefully neutral in that way that suggested centuries of practice at hiding reactions, and Mira recognized Dale's cousin immediately because he had the same thin-lipped smugness, though on him it was polished with expensive clothes and the confidence of someone who'd never been told no. Alaric had explained the procedure during the drive. Mira would testify under truth binding, a magical compulsion that made lying physically impossible, the words catching in your throat like cold metal if you tried to speak anything but absolute honesty. It was ancient magic, older than the council itself, and it meant every word she said would be weighed as fact rather than opinion. The truth binding also meant she couldn't refuse to answer, couldn't deflect or dodge, just had to stand there and bleed honesty in front of 13 predators who would parse every syllable for weakness. Marcus had coached her on how to phrase things, how to volunteer as little as possible, but Mira knew that the moment Voss started asking questions, all the coaching in the world wouldn't matter, because the binding would pull truth out of her whether she wanted to give it or not. She sat in the center chair and felt the binding settle over her like a weight, cold and invasive, wrapping around her vocal cords and threading into her lungs until speaking felt like pushing words through ice. Counselor Voss stood, his movements precise and theatrical, and began with the easy questions. State your name, your occupation, how you came to be at Rose City Diner on the night of March 15th. Mira answered mechanically, feeling the binding pulse with each word, a sensation like metal wires tightening and releasing around her throat to verify she was speaking truth. Then Voss shifted angles, his voice taking on that prosecutorial edge that suggested he already knew the answers and was just establishing them for the record. Did you know who the child was when you intervened? He asked, and Mira said no, feeling the binding accepted as truth. Did you research the Thorne family after being brought to the estate? He pressed, and again Mira said no. I was brought there immediately and spent the night processing what had happened. The binding hummed approval, and Voss's mouth tightened slightly, his script not going quite the way he'd planned. Do you expect financial compensation for your service as S.H.I.E.L.D.? He asked, pivoting to a new attack, and Mira had to force the words out through the binding's restriction. It was offered, money to clear my sister's medical debt, but that's not why I stayed. The chamber went very quiet, and Mira felt the weight of 13 vampire stares, calculating and assessing, trying to determine if she was lying, or naive, or genuinely altruistic. Voss smiled then, sharp and predatory, because he'd found his angle. "Then why did you stay, Miss Chen?" he asked, his voice deceptively gentle. "The binding wouldn't let you walk away from a magically enforced contract. Surely you understand that accepting the right meant you were trapped regardless of your feelings. Why claim you stayed for any reason other than self-preservation?" The binding seized her throat, and Mira tried to think of a diplomatic answer, some version of events that wouldn't expose the raw wound at her center, but the magic pulled truth out of her like poison from a wound. "Because she looked at me the way my sister did the night before she died," Mira heard herself say, her voice rough and too loud in the stone chamber. "Like she was drowning, and I was the only one who could see." The silence that followed was absolute, even the braziers seeming to quiet their crackling, and Mira felt tears burning behind her eyes, but refused to let them fall, because she would not give Voss that satisfaction. "So you stayed for yourself," Voss said, pressing his advantage with the skill of someone who'd prosecuted 1,000 cases. "To ease your guilt, to have another chance at playing savior, using this child as a surrogate for the sister you failed to save." Alaric surged to his feet, fury written in every line of his body, but Mira cut him off before he could speak, because the binding was pulling more truth, and she needed to say it herself. "Yes," she said clearly, meeting Voss's eyes with everything she had. "Maybe, I don't know. Guilt is complicated, and I'm not a therapist. But she's not my sister, and I'm not going to fail her the same way because she deserves someone who will stay when it gets hard, and apparently I'm too stupid to walk away from scared kids who need help." The binding accepted it, humming satisfaction through her chest, and Mira saw several council members exchange glances that might have been approval or might have been calculation. Voss opened his mouth to press further, but that's when the door at the back of the chamber opened, and every vampire in the room turned to look, their attention snapping toward the entrance with predatory synchronization. Sarah stood in the doorway in the same clothes she'd been wearing that morning, her hair tangled and her face set with a determination that looked wrong on a child's features. And Mira's heart stopped, because no one had brought her. The estate was miles away. She must have followed somehow through rain and streets, and the underground passages that led here. The girl walked into the chamber with slow, deliberate steps, her bare feet silent on the stone floor, and she moved past the council members who had all gone very still, past her father who looked like he'd been struck, straight toward Mira, who was trapped in the center chair with the truth binding still wrapped around her throat. Sarah stopped in front of her, and Mira saw her hands trembling, saw the exhaustion written in every line of her small body, saw the terror and resolve fighting for dominance in those two old eyes. Then Sarah opened her mouth and spoke for the first time in 17 years, her voice hoarse and unused and absolutely certain. "Stay," she said, the single word falling into the chamber like a stone into still water. She turned slightly to look at Alaric, who had gone paper white, and added in that same rough whisper, "Dad." Then her legs gave out and she collapsed, but Mira was already moving, the truth binding shattering like glass as she lunged forward to catch the girl, and something ignited in her chest. A flare of sensation like a brand being pressed to her ribs from the inside. The binding, the sanctuary rite that had been one-way protection, suddenly flooded both directions, and Mira gasped as Sarah's emotions crashed into her. Exhaustion so profound it felt like drowning. Terror that tasted like copper. Determination like steel wire. And underneath it all, a desperate love that was directed at both Mira and Alaric in equal measure. She could feel Sarah's heartbeat matching her own, could sense the girl's consciousness hovering at the edge of blackout, but fighting to stay aware, could taste the effort it had cost her to speak those two words after 17 years of silence. Alaric was there suddenly, his hands gentle as he lifted Sarah from Mira's arms, and his face was doing something Mira had never seen before. Grief and joy and terror all tangled together until he looked almost human. The council erupted into chaos, voices overlapping in languages Mira didn't recognize, but through the new connection to Sarah, she could feel the girl's awareness tracking everything, filing it away even as her body surrendered to exhaustion. Voss was trying to speak, trying to press his challenge, but Counselor Elena stood, and her voice cut through the noise like a blade. "The child has spoken," she said, her tone allowing no argument. "In front of 13 witnesses, she has given testimony that the bond is genuine and freely accepted on her part. The right stands validated. This hearing is closed." Several other council members nodded agreement, and Mira saw Voss's face go tight with fury, but he was outvoted and he knew it, could do nothing but bow stiffly and retreat to his seat while the rest of the council rose and began filing out. Marcus appeared at Mira's side, helping her stand on legs that didn't want to support her weight, and she realized she was shaking, the truth binding's residue, and the shock of Sarah's voice, and the new weight of the bi-directional connection, all combining into something that felt like being unmade and remade simultaneously. Alaric carried Sarah toward the exit, and Mira followed because the binding pulled her like a compass needle, the distance between them creating a tension she could feel in her bones, and she understood with sudden clarity that she would always know where Sarah was now, would always feel the girl's emotional state like a second heartbeat underneath her own. They made it to Alaric's car before anyone spoke. Sarah still unconscious in her father's arms, and Mira folding into the back seat with her head spinning and her chest aching where the binding had flared. The driver pulled away from the underground entrance, and Alaric finally looked at Mira with eyes that held too many emotions to parse. "The binding changed," he said quietly, "and it wasn't a question." Mira nodded, one hand pressed to her ribs where she could still feel the echo of that brand, the place where Sarah's emotions connected to hers. "I know," she said. "I felt her terror, her exhaustion, everything. She was so scared, but she came anyway." Alaric's arms tightened around Sarah, and he bowed his head until his forehead rested against his daughter's hair, and Mira heard him take a shaky breath that suggested he was fighting tears. "She spoke," he said, his voice cracking. "For you, for both of us, she broke 17 years of silence, and now I don't know what it cost her." The new binding hummed between Mira and Sarah, and through it she could sense the girl's dreams, fragmented and strange, but not nightmares, just the exhausted processing of a mind that had pushed itself past every limit. "She's okay," Mira said, surprised by her own certainty. "Tired, overwhelmed, but not broken. She chose this, chose to save me, and that's not failure, even if it cost her." Alaric looked up and met her eyes, and something passed between them. Some understanding that they were both responsible for this child now, in ways that went beyond magic or law, that Sarah had bound them together as much as the right had. "Thank you," he said, and the words carried weight, spoken equal to equal rather than king to subject. "For staying, for fighting, for being what she needed when I couldn't be." Mira wanted to deflect, to make some joke about not having much choice, but the truth was she had chosen this, every day since the diner she'd chosen to stay, and she was still choosing it now with the binding burning in her chest and Sarah's emotions bleeding into hers. "You're welcome," she said instead, and meant it. They drove through rain-slicked streets toward the estate, while Sarah slept, and the binding settled into something almost comfortable, a presence Mira was learning to filter and interpret, and she thought about the hearing and Voss's face and the moment when Sarah had spoken in front of the council. The girl had saved her, had exercised agency for the first time in 17 years to protect the human who'd stepped between her and Dale's anger, and that meant something Mira was still trying to understand. The binding pulsed warmth through her ribs, Sarah's subconscious reaching out even in sleep, and Mira found herself reaching back, sending comfort and safety and the promise that she wasn't going anywhere. Alaric watched this exchange with an expression that suggested he could sense it too through his own blood bond with Sarah. Seeing his daughter connect to someone else in ways she'd never connected to him, and Mira expected jealousy, but saw only relief and something that might have been hope. "We're in this together now," she said quietly, not quite a question. "All three of us, bound in ways that can't be undone." Alaric nodded, his hand gentle on Sarah's back, and through the new connection, Mira felt the girl's heartbeat steady and strong, her emotions settling into something like peace. The council had validated the right. Voss had been defeated, at least temporarily, and Sarah had found her voice. But Mira understood with cold clarity that this was just the beginning, that the binding's evolution meant new complications and dangers neither of them had anticipated. The air pressure in the car shifted subtly, that thunderstorm-breaking sensation from the chamber still lingering, and Mira pressed her hand to her ribs where Sarah's emotions hummed like a second pulse. She could feel the girl's trust absolute and unquestioning, could sense her relief at being held by her father, could taste the exhaustion that came from pushing past every boundary trauma had built. It was intimate in a way that made Mira's breath catch, this connection to another person's inner life, and she wondered what Sarah could feel from her in return. If the girl sensed Mira's fear and determination, and the dangerous affection that was growing despite every wall she'd built. They pulled through the estate gates, and Alaric carried Sarah inside while Mira followed, the binding stretching thin with distance before snapping back into comfortable range when she entered the house. And she understood that she would never be truly separate from this child again, that Sarah's pain would be her pain, and her joy would be Mira's joy, and they would navigate this strange new intimacy together, whether either of them was ready or not. Alaric laid Sarah in her bed and stepped back to let Mira settle beside her, recognizing that the girl would want Mira close when she woke, and his expression held gratitude and grief, and something else Mira was afraid to name. The binding flared once more as Sarah's hand found Mira's in sleep, small fingers wrapping tight, and through the connection, Mira felt the girl's absolute certainty that she was safe now, that her family was complete, that the woman who'd stepped between her and danger would stay. Mira's throat closed with emotion, and she looked up to find Alaric watching them with that same complicated expression, and she realized that everything had changed in that council chamber, that they'd crossed some threshold that meant there was no going back to the careful distance of employer and employee, king and subject, vampire and human. They were family now, messy and bound and incomplete, but choosing each other anyway. And the weight of that settled over Mira like a vow she hadn't spoken but would keep regardless. Mira sat in the chair beside Sarah's bed, watching the girl sleep with one hand resting lightly on the small shoulder, feeling the binding pulse like a second heartbeat underneath her own ribs, steady and warm and strange in ways she was still learning to interpret. The dreams bleeding through the connection were fragmented, images and sensations rather than coherent narratives. Mira's voice reading stories, the texture of toast she couldn't eat, the feeling of speaking after 17 years of silence, exhaustion like a weight pressing down. Not nightmares, though, Mira catalogued with relief, just the normal processing of a mind that had been pushed past its limits and was slowly putting itself back together. The lamplight was soft and golden, turning Sarah's room into something gentler than the pastel prison it had been when Mira first saw it. And she realized Alaric had been true to his word about removing the window bars because the ironwork was gone, leaving just glass and the rain-streaked view of the estate grounds beyond. A knock at the door pulled her attention, and Alaric entered carrying a tray that held actual food rather than the generic sustenance she'd been making for herself, and Mira recognized her favorites from the Thai place near her old apartment, the ones she'd ordered every Friday when Maya was still alive, and they'd pretended things were normal. You researched me again, she said, but there was no heat in it, just tired amusement at his thoroughness. He set the tray on the desk and had the grace to look slightly sheepish. I wanted to do something useful, he said, and you haven't eaten since breakfast. They fell into conversation while Mira ate, both of them keeping their voices low so as not to disturb Sarah, and Alaric explained the binding's new mechanics with the precision of someone who'd spent the afternoon consulting every text he owned. Emotions bleed through when they're strong enough, he said, watching the sleeping girl with an expression that suggested he was feeling echoes of her dreams through his own blood bond. Distance weakens the connection but doesn't break it. You'll always know roughly where she is and how she's feeling, and in moments of extreme distress, the link will pull you toward her whether you want it to or not. Mira absorbed this, thinking about the flare in the council chamber and the way she'd felt Sarah's terror and determination like they were her own. What happens if she gets hurt? She asked, because the question had been sitting in her chest since the binding changed, and she needed to know the parameters of what she'd agreed to. Alaric was quiet for a long moment, his gaze distant, before answering with the same brutal honesty he'd shown when admitting he didn't know his daughter anymore. You'll share the pain, he said. Potentially the injury itself, depending on severity. The rite was designed to make attacking a shielded child prohibitively costly, because harming her means harming you, and most aggressors won't risk killing a human under royal protection. But it also means you could die protecting her if someone is determined enough or reckless enough not to care about the consequences. Mira felt the weight of that settle over her like a physical thing, but found she wasn't surprised, had maybe known it on some level since the binding first locked into place. I know, she said quietly. I felt the contract lock when she spoke in the council chamber, felt it burn into my ribs like a brand. You could die as the price for this kind of protection. Alaric looked at her with something that might have been anguish or admiration or both. I'm sorry, he said, and she heard genuine regret in his voice, not for binding her, but for the cost it carried. Mira shook her head because she'd made her peace with this already, had chosen it every day since stepping between Sarah and Dale's anger. Don't be, she said. I chose this the second I stepped between her and Dale, and I chose it again every time I stayed. If the price is sharing her pain, then that's still better than walking away and wondering if she'd be okay without me. Alaric's expression did something complicated, and he opened his mouth like he was going to argue, or thank her, or say something that would make this moment bigger than it needed to be, but Sarah stirred slightly in her sleep, and they both went still, waiting. The binding pulsed warmth, and the girl settled again, her dreams shifting toward something that felt like contentment. And Mira found herself smiling despite the exhaustion pulling at her bones. She's dreaming about the stories I read her, she said, feeling the images bleed through the connection. The one about the girl who saved the kingdom with a broken sword and too much stubbornness. Alaric's mouth twitched toward a smile and he stood, collecting the empty food containers with movements that were trying for casual but came across stiff. Get some rest, he said. I'll be in my study if either of you need anything. He left before Mira could respond, and she settled deeper into the chair, her hand still on Sarah's shoulder, letting the binding's steady pulse lull her toward sleep. Alaric made it to his study before his phone started ringing, the display showing Marcus's number with the kind of insistence that suggested bad news couldn't wait for morning. He answered and listened to his oldest ally explain in clipped professional tones that Voss had leaked details of the hearing to vampire media networks, spinning the narrative to make Alaric look desperate and weak, a king so unable to control his own household that he'd resorted to binding a random human to his damaged daughter. The headline Marcus read aloud made Alaric's jaw tighten. King binds human to daughter in desperate bid, and the article went on to speculate about political instability and whether Alaric's line was too compromised to maintain their holdings. It was character assassination dressed up as news. And worse, it painted a target on Mira by suggesting she was a vulnerability, a human shield whose death would dissolve the right and leave Sarah unprotected again. Marcus was already strategizing counter-moves, calling in favors and preparing statements. But Alaric barely heard him, because his mind was racing through scenarios where Voss's allies decided the easiest way to destabilize his house was to eliminate Mira and watch everything collapse. He ended the call and immediately started making his own calls, activating old alliances and pulling strings he'd been saving for emergencies, his voice cold and controlled, even as fury burned underneath. 3 calls in, he felt the tremor start in his hands, subtle but unmistakable, his body finally acknowledging what he'd been ignoring for weeks. He hadn't fed properly since before Sarah's first escape, had been surviving on animal blood purchased from a supplier who asked no questions, and it wasn't enough. Had never been enough, but he'd convinced himself he could manage because the alternative was hunting, and hunting meant going to places that might trigger Sarah's trauma if she ran again. The tremor worsened, and he set the phone down carefully, pressing his palms flat against the desk to hide the shaking. Vampires didn't starve the way humans did. The process was slower and more insidious, a gradual weakening that crept up until suddenly you couldn't trust your own strength or speed or judgment. He'd pushed it too far, he realized with cold clarity, had let his guilt and fear override basic survival needs, and now he was compromised exactly when he needed to be sharp. The study door opened without a knock, and Mira stood there in the lamplight, looking exhausted and worried, her eyes going immediately to his hands and the way he was bracing himself against the desk. "When did you last feed?" she asked. No preamble. And Alaric tried to deflect with some comment about being fine, but she cut him off with a look that suggested she'd had enough of his evasions. "You can't protect us if you're starving," she said flatly. And he realized she'd been reading the vampire texts in his library, had educated herself enough to recognize the signs. Before Sarah's first escape, he admitted, because the binding wouldn't let him lie to her even without magical compulsion. "Weeks ago, maybe longer, I stopped hunting in the city after she ran the 3rd time, because she associates my feeding with the attack and I won't risk traumatizing her again. I've been using animal blood, but it's not sufficient for long-term survival." Mira crossed the room and he saw her processing this, saw the moment she connected his self-sacrifice to the tremor in his hands and the pallor he could no longer hide. She looked furious and sad and determined all at once, and when she started rolling up her sleeve, he understood what she was offering before she spoke. The refusal was automatic and visceral, every instinct screaming that she was under his protection and feeding from her would violate every principle he'd built his rule on. "No," he said, more sharply than he intended. "You're under my protection. It would be a violation of the right and my own code. I won't." Mira's expression didn't change, that stubborn set to her jaw that he was starting to recognize as her "I've made a decision" face. "The binding means I'm family now," she said. "And family takes care of each other. You told me that yourself when you were explaining why you bound me. This is me taking care of family." Alaric felt something crack in his chest at the simple logic of it, at this human woman who'd been dragged into his life offering herself to sustain him, because she'd decided they were worth protecting. "If you consent freely and witnessed," he started, falling back on formal protocols because it was the only way he could allow himself to accept. But she interrupted him with characteristic impatience. "I consent," she said clearly. "Sarah's sleeping upstairs, but she'll feel my choice through the link. That's witness enough under your laws. Now sit down before you fall down and let me help." He sat because his legs were shaking now too, and Mira pulled over the other chair, settling close enough that he could smell her, human warmth and the faint scent of the Thai food she'd eaten, and underneath it her blood, rich and vital in a way that made his fangs ache. She held out her wrist with steady hands, and he took it gently, his fingers finding her pulse and feeling it jump under his touch. "This isn't romantic," he said, needing her to understand that he wasn't taking advantage, even as every cell in his body screamed for what she was offering. "It's necessity, practical, just family taking care of each other." Mira's mouth quirked in something that wasn't quite a smile. I know, she said. Now stop talking and just do it before I lose my nerve. He bit quickly and cleanly, his fangs finding the vein with centuries of practice, and her blood hit his system like electricity, rich and human and alive in ways animal blood could never match. The intimacy was immediate and undeniable, not sexual but profound, a connection that went deeper than the physical act because vampire feeding carried emotional resonance, tastes, and sensations that spoke to the donor's inner state. He could taste Mira's emotions in her blood, fierce protectiveness that was directed equally at Sarah and himself, bone-deep exhaustion that she was pushing through on pure stubbornness, fear about the media leak and what it meant for their safety, and underneath it all, unexpected and warm and dangerous, genuine affection, not just for Sarah, but for him. This human woman who had every reason to hate him for binding her had somehow decided he was worth caring about anyway. The taste of it nearly undid him, and he pulled back well before he'd taken enough to satisfy his hunger completely, sealing the wound with a touch of his tongue and releasing her wrist like it burned. Mira sat very still, one hand pressed to the bite mark, and the silence between them was charged with everything they weren't saying. You taste like loyalty, he said quietly, because he needed to acknowledge what he'd felt even if he couldn't name the rest of it. And something else I don't deserve. Mira stood abruptly, not meeting his eyes, and headed for the door without responding. When she reached it, she paused with her hand on the frame, her back still to him. Sarah's dreams just shifted, she said, her voice carefully neutral. She felt my choice through the binding, and she's happy about it, relieved that you're going to be okay. Then she was gone, the door closing softly behind her. And Alaric sat alone in his study, feeling steadier in body, but shaken in ways that had nothing to do with hunger. Mira made it back to Sarah's room before her composure cracked, sinking into the chair beside the bed and pressing her hand to the bite mark that still throbbed with residual warmth. Through the binding, she could feel Sarah's contentment, a sleepy approval that her father had finally fed, that Mira had taken care of him the way she'd been taking care of Sarah. And the simple trust of it made her throat close. She'd expected the feeding to be clinical, transactional, just solving a problem the way you'd hand someone a bandage for a cut. She hadn't expected the intimacy of it, the way Alaric's mouth on her wrist had felt like being seen in ways she normally kept hidden, hadn't expected to feel his hunger and relief and careful control, or the moment when he'd tasted her emotions and his whole body had gone rigid with shock. The warmth underneath her protectiveness, the affection she'd been trying not to acknowledge, he'd tasted it and known it for what it was, and she couldn't take it back now, couldn't pretend it was just about Sarah. Mira pressed both hands to her face and tried to think through the exhaustion and confusion, tried to parse whether what she felt was real or just a trauma response to being bound to someone powerful who'd shown her unexpected kindness. The binding pulsed, and she felt Sarah's dreams shift toward awareness, the girl sensing Mira's distress and starting to surface from sleep. Mira forced herself to breathe evenly, to project calm through the connection, and after a moment, Sarah settled again, reassured but not fully convinced. The rain drummed against the windows, and the lamplight made everything soft-edged and surreal, and Mira sat in the chair feeling the double pulse of her heartbeat and the binding, trying to figure out how to navigate a situation that was getting more complicated with each passing hour. She'd come here to protect Sarah, had accepted the binding and its costs because a child needed someone who would stay, but somewhere in the past 36 hours, it had become more than that, had expanded to include a vampire king who starved himself rather than risk his daughter's trauma, and who looked at Mira like she was something precious when he thought she wasn't paying attention. The bite mark throbbed, and through the binding she felt Sarah's absolute certainty that this was right, that the three of them belonged together, that Mira taking care of Alaric was just as important as taking care of her. Mira wanted to argue with the logic, but couldn't quite manage it, because the girl had a point. They were bound together now in ways that meant they had to take care of each other, or the whole structure would collapse. Family takes care of each other, she'd told Alaric, using his own words against him, and she'd meant it even knowing it would crack open something between them that neither was ready to handle. Downstairs in his study, she felt rather than heard Alaric moving, pacing probably, working through whatever he'd tasted in her blood and deciding how to proceed. The distance made the binding stretch thin but didn't break it, and Mira was grateful for the space, even as part of her wanted to go back down and demand they talk about what had just happened. Sarah's hand found hers in sleep, small fingers wrapping tight, and through the connection, Mira felt the girl's dreams shift back toward contentment, that simple child's certainty that the adults would figure it out because they had to, because she needed them both. Mira closed her eyes and let the binding's pulse steady her, let Sarah's trust anchor her, and tried not to think about the warmth that had flooded through Alaric's expression when he'd pulled back from her wrist, tried not to catalog the way her own pulse had jumped when his fingers had steadied her arm. The feeding had been necessity and transaction, and family taking care of family, she told herself firmly, and if it had felt like more than that, if the silence afterward had been charged with dangerous possibility, that was just exhaustion and adrenaline and too many emotions processed in too short a time. The bite mark throbbed once more like punctuation, and Mira pressed her thumb against it, feeling the echo of Alaric's careful control, and the moment when that control had nearly shattered because he'd tasted something in her blood he hadn't expected. "You taste like loyalty, and something else I don't deserve," he'd said, and she'd run, because the something else was affection and attraction, and the beginning of feelings she had no business developing for a vampire king who held her life in his hands through ancient laws and magical contracts. Sarah sighed in her sleep and pulled Mira's hand closer, anchoring her with that simple gesture of trust, and Mira forced herself to stop spiraling and just breathe. Tomorrow she would figure out how to navigate this new complexity, how to maintain boundaries while living in close quarters with someone whose emotions she could taste in her blood and who now knew exactly how she felt about him. Tonight she would sit in this chair and keep watch over a girl who'd spoken for the first time in 17 years, who'd saved Mira's life by walking into a council chamber and claiming her as family, who trusted absolutely that the adults would protect her even while protecting each other. The binding pulsed warm and steady, and Mira let it lull her toward sleep, her last conscious thought that they'd crossed too many boundaries tonight to ever go back to the careful distance of strangers, that the feeding had changed something fundamental between her and Alaric, just as Sarah's voice had changed everything in the council chamber. And tomorrow, they would all have to figure out how to live with the intimacy that circumstance and magic had forced on them, whether they were ready or not. Mira woke to sunlight instead of rain for the first time since arriving at the estate. Pale gold streaming through the guest room windows and painting everything in shades of hope she wasn't sure she trusted yet. The binding pulsed steady and warm, Sarah already awake in the next room, and Mira felt the girl's emotional state like morning coffee, sharp and clarifying. Relief mixed with determination, and underneath it all, a satisfaction that felt almost smug. She found Sarah sitting cross-legged on her bed, fully dressed, hands moving in the signs they'd developed over the past days, and the girl's expression held knowledge that made Mira's chest tighten because she understood immediately that Sarah knew about last night, had felt Mira's choice to feed Alaric through the binding, and was processing what it meant. "You stayed," Sarah signed, then pointed at the floor below them where Alaric's study was located. "Dad stayed." The words came haltingly, her voice still rough from disuse, but growing stronger with each attempt. "Family." Mira sat on the edge of the bed and felt tears burning behind her eyes because the girl's relief was palpable through the binding. This child who'd been so afraid of being abandoned that she'd orchestrated her appearance at the council hearing, not just to save Mira, but to bind all three of them together in ways that couldn't be easily undone. "You knew," Mira said, not quite a question. "When you walked into that chamber, you knew speaking would change the binding, would connect us all." Sarah nodded, her dark eyes serious and far too old. and signed slowly. Scared Dad would disappear, that he'd starve himself into torpor the way vampires did when they gave up, scared you would leave because it was too hard. The binding hummed between them, and Mira felt the girl's fear transmuting into relief, this certainty that now both her chosen adults had proven they would stay. Through halting signs and words, Sarah explained what Mira was only beginning to understand. The girl had been aware of far more than anyone realized, had tracked her father's decline and Mira's growing attachment, and the political machinations swirling around them, had made the calculated choice to speak in front of the council because it would force everything into the open and bind them together in ways that made leaving impossible. She was 8 years old in body, but her mind had been aging for 17 years, developing strategy and awareness while trapped in a child's frozen form, and the intelligence behind her actions was both heartbreaking and humbling. Mira pulled Sarah into a hug and felt the girl relax against her, small arms wrapping tight, and through the binding she sensed absolute trust. This certainty that her family was complete now and safe and wouldn't fragment. "I'm not going anywhere," Mira said into Sarah's hair. "Neither is your dad. I made sure of that last night. And you're stuck with both of us whether you like it or not." Sarah's laugh was rusty but genuine, and she pulled back to sign thank you with fingers that trembled slightly, exhaustion still catching up with her, but determination winning out. The morning light painted them both gold, and the binding pulsed warmth, and Mira thought about how much had changed in 4 days. How a chance encounter in a diner had turned into chosen family bound by ancient magic and modern need. By midday, Mira needed space to think, the binding's constant presence making it hard to process her own emotions, separate from Sarah's contentment and Alaric's careful distance. She told them she was going out for coffee, just an hour to clear her head, and saw understanding flash across Alaric's face before he assigned 2 of his security team to follow at a discreet distance. The coffee shop was 3 blocks from the estate, bright and crowded with Sunday brunch people, and Mira ordered something complicated with too much foam while trying to feel normal and failing spectacularly. She was stirring sugar into her cup when a man sat down across from her uninvited, his smile friendly, but his eyes calculating in a way that made her skin crawl. "Miss Chen," he said, his voice pitched low and concerned. "I'm a friend. Someone who thinks you should know what you've gotten yourself into." Mira's hand tightened on her cup, and she felt the security team shift closer in her peripheral vision, but the man kept talking, words tumbling out like he was genuinely worried. "Alaric Thorne is using you," he said. "The binding might seem protective now, but it's designed to split damage between shield and protected, which means if anything happens to his daughter, you'll share her injuries, potentially her death. You're human, fragile, and vampire politics are vicious. How long do you think you'll survive once his enemies realize the easiest way to hurt him is through you?" The words landed like stones, and Mira recognized manipulation when she heard it. Recognized Voss's fingerprints all over this concerned citizen act, but she also heard the seed of truth buried in the lies. The binding was dangerous, she'd known that intellectually, but hearing it stated so baldly made it real in new ways. "You should leave while you can," the man continued. "Before you're in too deep. Before caring about them gets you killed. There are resources, people who can help you disappear if you want out." Mira stood abruptly, her chair scraping loud against the floor. "Tell Voss I'm not interested in his help," she said clearly. "And that threatening me is threatening Alaric's house, which seems like a stupid political move even for someone as transparent as your boss." The man's friendly expression cracked into something uglier, but he left, melting into the crowd, and Mira walked out with her coffee untouched and her heart hammering. The security team flanked her on the walk back, and she felt the binding pull tight, Sarah's sudden anxiety bleeding through as the girl sensed Mira's distress. And by the time she reached the estate, Alaric was waiting in the foyer with fury written in every line of his body. Voss sent someone, he said without preamble. And it wasn't a question. Mira nodded and watched him process this. Watched the rage and fear and guilt cycle through his expression before settling into something colder and more controlled. I'm handling it, he said. Making calls, ensuring it won't happen again. But the fact that he reached you at all is unacceptable. Mira felt her own anger rising to match his, sharp and clarifying. Tell me the truth, she said. All of it, not just the pieces you think I can handle. What are the real risks of this binding? Alaric went very still, and she saw him making the calculation, deciding whether to protect her with ignorance or trust her with honesty. And after a long moment, he gestured toward his study. We should sit for this, he said quietly. The study smelled like old books, and the faint mineral scent of very old vampires, and Mira sat in the burgundy chair while Alaric positioned himself behind his desk, that king posture he fell into when he needed distance. If Sarah is ever mortally wounded, he said without preamble, the binding will try to split the damage between you. The magic doesn't distinguish between vampire healing capacity and human fragility, which means an injury she could survive might kill you outright. If you die first, Sarah will feel it through the link, and the trauma could cause complete psychological retreat, undoing all the progress she's made. The rite was designed for vampire shields who could heal from almost anything. You're human and breakable, and I bound you without fully considering those implications. Mira absorbed this, her mind cataloging scenarios and probabilities, trying to assess risk with incomplete information. He's been researching, she realized, seeing the books stacked on his desk, texts on magical theory and binding modification. You're looking for ways to strengthen me without turning me, she said, and saw confirmation in his expression. Turning me would break the rite's human claws, wouldn't it? The whole point is that I'm mortal and vulnerable, which makes attacking Sarah prohibitively costly. But you're trying to find middle ground, some way to make me less fragile. Alaric nodded, his hands flat on the desk. I've consulted every expert I can trust, he said. There are options, protections I can layer on top of the rite, but they're imperfect and some carry their own risks. The truth is I bound you to save her, and I didn't think about saving you, about the cost you'd pay for being her shield. That was selfish, short-sighted, and I'm sorry. The admission hung between them, and Mira felt something shift, her anger transmuting into understanding because she could see his guilt, could recognize that he was trying to fix a mistake he hadn't realized he was making. So what now? She asked. You unbind me, ask the council to dissolve the rite, and let me walk away. Alaric's expression did something complicated, pain and relief and resignation all fighting for dominance. I can't, he said quietly. Only the council can dissolve a witnessed rite, and they won't. It would insult Sarah's choice and set a precedent that any binding could be challenged after the fact. You're stuck with this, with us, unless you petition the council yourself and convince them your consent was coerced. Mira thought about Sarah upstairs, about the binding's warmth and the girl's trust and the way she'd orchestrated everything to keep her family together. Good, she said, because I'm not leaving. Alaric looked up sharply. Even if it kills you, he asked, and she heard genuine fear under the question. People die, Alaric, Mira said, her voice steady. My sister died, and I couldn't stop it. Watched her fade over months while I tried everything and failed anyway. At least this time I'm choosing the risk, choosing to protect someone who needs it instead of standing helpless while cancer does its work. If the cost of being Sarah's shield is sharing her pain, then that's still better than the alternative. The study was silent except for the ticking of an antique clock and the sound of Alaric's breath, unnecessary but automatic, and Mira saw him struggling with this, with her acceptance of mortality as the price of family. The door opened and Sarah walked in, her movements deliberate and her expression determined, and both adults turned to look at the girl, who'd somehow known this conversation was happening and decided to interrupt. Not leaving, Sarah said, her voice clearer than it had been in the council chamber, strengthening with use. Any of us. She crossed to Mira and took her hand, then reached for Alaric's, pulling them together until they formed a circle, three hands linked in the space between the desk and the chair. Family, Sarah said firmly, and the binding flared warm through Mira's chest. Not painful, but intense. Sarah intentionally sharing her feeling of safety and belonging through the connection. Mira gasped and felt Alaric stiffen beside her, his own blood bond with Sarah activating so he could feel it too, this deliberate gift of the girl's emotional state. The three of them were linked now, magic and blood and choice tangling together until Mira couldn't tell where one connection ended and another began, and she felt Sarah's absolute certainty that this was right, that they belonged together, that the risks were worth it because family protected each other and chose to stay even when it was hard. Alaric made a sound that might have been a laugh or a sob, and Mira found herself laughing too, a little hysterical, the absurdity and beauty of it all hitting her simultaneously. Sarah smiled, not the tentative, almost expression from before, but a real smile that transformed her whole face, and Mira saw the ghost of who this child had been before the attack, bright and certain and full of joy. The binding pulsed once more and settled, the warmth fading to a steady background hum, and they stood in the study holding hands like some kind of awkward family portrait until Sarah tugged them both toward the door. "Kitchen," she said. "Cookies." Mira and Alaric exchanged glances over her head, something passing between them that acknowledged the complexity of what they'd just agreed to, the risks and the intimacy, and the fact that they were bound together now in ways that went beyond magic, and then they followed the girl who'd orchestrated all of this down the hallway toward the kitchen. Evening found them in domestic tableau that would have seemed impossible 4 days ago. Mira measuring flour, while Sarah watched with intense focus. Alaric at the kitchen island with case files spread around him, but his attention splitting between the documents and his daughter's halting questions about why butter needed to be cold and whether vanilla extract smelled the same to vampires as it did in her memories from before. The media storm had died down after Alaric's formal statement, a coldly worded declaration that Mira Chen was family under his protection and any threat to her would be met with the full force of his house's retaliation. Voss had backed off, at least publicly, though Mira knew from Marcus's call earlier that the counselor was still maneuvering behind the scenes, looking for new angles of attack. The council itself had sent a private message of support, several members expressing that they'd been moved by Sarah's breakthrough and understood the validity of the binding in ways that transcended politics. Mira's medical debt had vanished from her account sometime during the afternoon, cleared by an anonymous benefactor who was absolutely Alaric, though he'd denied involvement when she'd confronted him about it. The binding hummed steady between her and Sarah, emotions bleeding through when strong but mostly settling into comfortable background awareness, and Mira was learning to filter it, to distinguish her own feelings from the girls'. Sarah's vocabulary was expanding daily, her voice strengthening with use, though she was still selective about speaking, choosing words carefully, and falling back on signs when exhausted. The physical therapist Alaric had hired said it was normal, that vocal cords needed retraining after 17 years of disuse, and the psychologist specialized in vampire trauma had been cautiously optimistic about Sarah's progress. "It's not a cure," the psychologist had warned. "She'll have hard days, setbacks, triggers we haven't identified yet. But she's demonstrating remarkable resilience, and the family structure you've built is exactly what she needs." Mira spooned cookie dough onto baking sheets while Sarah leaned close to smell the raw dough, her nose wrinkling at the sugar. And through the binding, Mira felt the girl's contentment, this simple pleasure in process and proximity. The oven timer beeped, and Mira slid the first batch in, setting the timer and turning to find Sarah watching her with that too-old awareness. The girl's hands moved in signs, deliberate and careful. "Thank you for staying, for feeding Dad, for being family. Then, aloud and tentative, Mom. The word hung in the air like a question, and Mira's throat closed, tears burning sudden and fierce, because she hadn't expected this, hadn't let herself hope that the binding and the protection and the choice to stay would translate into something this profound. She crouched down to Sarah's level and signed back. If you want, giving the girl the choice the way she always tried to. Sarah nodded immediately, no hesitation, and launched herself into Mira's arms with enough force to nearly knock them both over. Mira held her tight and felt the binding pulse approval, felt Sarah's joy bleeding through pure and uncomplicated. And when she looked up, she saw Alaric watching them with his hand pressed to his mouth and tears tracking down his face. He turned away quickly, trying for privacy, but not before Mira saw the grief and gratitude warring in his expression. This vampire king who'd failed to reach his daughter for 17 years, watching her choose a mother, and being grateful even as it broke something in him. The moment stretched and settled, becoming memory, and Mira stood with Sarah still clinging to her, meeting Alaric's eyes across the kitchen. "Thank you," he said quietly, "for giving her what I couldn't, for staying when you had every reason to run, for being family even though we gave you no choice about it." Mira shook her head because the thanks felt wrong when she'd gained as much as she'd given, when the binding had stopped feeling like a trap and started feeling like belonging. "We chose each other," she said. "All three of us, messy and imperfect and bound by magic and blood and too much stubbornness to quit. That's family." The oven timer went off, and Sarah wiggled down to inspect the cookies, pronouncing them acceptable even though she couldn't eat them, and they fell into comfortable routine. Mira baking, Sarah asking questions about measurements and chemistry, Alaric answering when he could, and admitting ignorance when he couldn't. All three of them orbiting each other in the too big kitchen that finally felt like it belonged to people instead of showcasing expensive appliances. The evening light turned everything golden, and the binding hummed its steady rhythm, and Mira thought about the diner 4 days ago. About stepping between a scared child and an angry manager without knowing it would lead here, to chosen family and magical contracts, and a vampire king who tasted her emotions in her blood and looked at her like she was something precious. It wasn't a fairy tale ending, she knew that. The threats remained, and Voss would try again, and her mortality was a ticking clock that would eventually force decisions none of them wanted to make. Sarah would have hard days when the trauma resurged and the binding would flare with shared pain. And whatever was growing between Mira and Alaric would have to be navigated carefully around power imbalances and the girl who needed them both stable. But right now, in this moment, they were safe and together and choosing each other every day, and that was enough. Sarah looked up from the cooling cookies and signed, "I love you" to Mira, then turned and said it aloud to Alaric, "I love you, Dad." The words were halting but clear, and Alaric's composure cracked completely, dropping into the chair beside his daughter and pulling her into his lap, his face pressed to her hair while his shoulders shook. Mira turned away to give them privacy and felt the binding pulse with Sarah's joy and relief. This certainty that her father had finally heard what she'd been unable to say for 17 years. When Alaric's breathing evened out, he looked up at Mira with red-rimmed eyes and something vulnerable in his expression. "Thank you," he said again, but this time it carried different weight, gratitude not just for Sarah, but for everything, for the feeding and the trust and the choice to stay, even knowing the risks. Mira crossed to the table and sat down, the three of them forming a triangle in the golden kitchen light, and let herself acknowledge what she'd been avoiding, that she cared about both of them, that the binding to Sarah had somehow expanded to include feelings for Alaric that were complicated and dangerous and real. "We'll figure it out," she said, meaning all of it. The threats and the binding and whatever was growing between the adults underneath the focus on Sarah's healing, one day at a time, together. Alaric nodded and Sarah wiggled between them, taking both their hands again, forming that circle of linked fingers and shared magic. "Family," she said firmly. And through the binding, Mira felt the girl's absolute conviction that this was right, that they belonged together regardless of how unconventional or complicated it was. The kitchen smelled like vanilla and sugar, the cookies cooling on the counter that Sarah would never eat, but had wanted to make anyway. And outside the windows, the estate grounds stretched green and peaceful in the fading light. It wasn't perfect, would never be perfect, but it was theirs. A vampire king learning to be a father again, a human woman who'd found family in the last place she expected, and a child slowly healing with the certainty that she was loved and safe and chosen. The binding pulsed warm one final time and settled, and Mira looked at the two people who'd become her family in 4 impossible days, and thought that maybe, despite everything, this was exactly where she was supposed to be.